There are stories that live on because they are told with depth, with care, with the kind of detail that makes them impossible to forget. And then there are stories that fade, not because they lack importance, but because they were never given the chance to be told properly. Count Dooku is one of those stories. He was a legend reduced to a footnote, a force of nature turned into a disposable villain, a fallen Jedi whose pain, wisdom, and ambition were never truly given the weight they deserved. The prequels gave us glimpses of his greatness, moments where his power and intelligence shined through. But that is all they were, glimpses. His battles were brief, his motives vague, his presence fleeting. He appeared, he fought, and then he was gone, discarded without ceremony, without reflection. And that should have been the end of his story. But then the Clone Wars came along, and for the first time, Count Dooku was more than just a Sith Lord. He was a mastermind, a tactician, a warrior who moved with purpose. He was dangerous, not because of his title, but because of his mind. That is what made him terrifying. He was not reckless, he was not blinded by rage, he was not a mere servant of Palpatine. He was precise, disciplined, and always in control. He did not seek destruction for the sake of destruction. He sought a new order, a better galaxy. And unlike so many others, he was willing to tear everything down to make that vision a reality. He did not play by the rules, because he had already seen that the rules were flawed. He had already seen that the Republic was a machine, too broken to be repaired. And yet, despite all his power, despite all his brilliance, he was doomed. Because no matter how far he had fallen, no matter how much he had convinced himself that he was in control, he was still a pawn in a game he could never win. His tragedy was not that he was defeated, was that he never even realized he had already lost. That is what made him one of the most compelling characters in Star Wars. Not because he was evil, but because he was right about so many things. And still, he was wrong in the end. In this video, we are going to explore why Count Dooku in the Clone Wars was far superior to his portrayal in the prequels. We will look at his mastery, his strategy, his philosophy, and the tragedy that made his story unforgettable. We will break down what made him such a brilliant villain, and why his presence in the animated series changed everything. This is not just a comparison, it is a deep dive into the character that could have been so much more. Count Dooku in the Clone Wars was a force to be reckoned with. Every time he stepped onto the battlefield or into a political discussion, he radiated power. He was not just some Sith apprentice blindly following orders, he was a master of deception and manipulation. He played the Republic and the Separatists against each other like pieces on a grand chessboard. His combat skills were also beyond what we saw in the prequels. He did not just twirl a lightsaber and exchange a few lines of dialogue before the fight ended. He dueled with purpose, with precision, with the kind of finesse that made him seem untouchable. Opponents trembled when facing him because they knew they stood no chance. The show made it clear that Dooku was not just a stepping stone for Anakin and Obi-Wan, he was a legend in his own right. Then there was his voice, his demeanor, his presence. He spoke with a calm authority that made every word feel heavy, as if they carried the weight of centuries of wisdom. He was not an impatient brute like some Sith lords. He was a tactician who understood the long game. He did not need to constantly shout or rage to prove his strength. His control over every situation spoke for itself. Yet beneath that control, there was something even more compelling. A sense of weariness, of disappointment, of a man who had seen too much corruption to believe in the Republic anymore. Unlike the prequels, where he felt like a mere puppet for Palpatine, the Clone Wars showed that Dooku had his own goals, his own convictions, his own tragedy. It is almost frustrating to think about what Count Dooku could have been. He had the talent, the experience, and the intelligence to be a leader who truly changed the galaxy. If he had been given more depth in the prequels, he might have been one of the greatest characters in Star Wars history. Instead, the movies reduced him to a temporary villain meant to be discarded. That is the difference. In the Clone Wars, he felt like a warrior who had walked away from the Jedi for reasons that made sense. He was not just a Sith for the sake of being a Sith, he had legitimate grievances against the Republic. He saw the corruption, the hypocrisy, the way the Jedi had become little more than pawns for politicians. And because of that, he took action. But in the prequels, his potential was wasted. He appeared, fought a bit, got his hands chopped off, and then was executed, without a second thought. His death was not tragic, it was not impactful, it was just another plot point to move Anakin's story forward. No one mourned him, no one reflected on what he had tried to do, no one even mentioned his name afterward. The Clone Wars did not make that mistake. It gave him victories, failures, moments of doubt, moments of strength. It made him someone you could respect, even if you did not agree with his choices. It made you wonder what might have happened if he had taken a different path. It made him feel like a character who mattered. One of the most impressive things about Dooku in the Clone Wars was his strategic mind. He was not just some Sith charging into battle without a plan. He was always thinking 3 steps ahead. He did not fight unless he had to, and when he did, he made sure it was on his terms. He was always in control, always one move ahead of his enemies. The show constantly reinforced this idea. He did not just send armies to die for no reason, he had a purpose behind every action. He manipulated entire star systems, orchestrated betrayals, and ensured that the Republic and the Jedi were always struggling to keep up. He did not fight for chaos like some Sith, he fought for a new order, a galaxy that he believed would be stronger without the weaknesses of the Republic. And when he did take up his lightsaber, it was not just for show. He did not waste time with unnecessary flourishes. He was a master of Makashi, the most precise and elegant form of lightsaber combat. Every movement had a purpose. Every strike was deadly. He did not need to rely on brute force. He could dismantle an opponent with pure skill. That is what made him terrifying. But beyond the combat, beyond the strategy, there was something else that made him fascinating. He was not just playing a role, he truly believed in what he was doing. He saw himself as the savior of the galaxy, not as a villain. That is what made him dangerous. That is what made him compelling. That is what made him better than his prequel counterpart. Dooku's fall to the dark side was not the same as Anakin's. It was not driven by raw emotion, by fear, or anger, or desperation. It was a slow realization, a quiet certainty that the Jedi had lost their way. He had been one of them. He had been a great Jedi, but he could no longer pretend that their path was right. He saw the flaws too clearly. And that is what made him so different. He did not fall because he was weak. He fell because he thought he was strong enough to fix what was broken. He believed he could shape the galaxy into something better. He was not reckless. He was not driven by personal gain. He truly thought he was doing what needed to be done. That is why he was such an interesting villain, but the tragedy was that he was wrong. He had seen the corruption of the Republic, but he did not realize that he had just stepped into something worse. He thought he was in control, but Palpatine had been playing him the entire time. He was a master of strategy, but he had been outmaneuvered by someone even greater. That realization, that cruel irony, was heartbreaking. The Clone Wars made sure we saw that. We saw the weight of his decisions, the burden of his choices. We saw the moment when he started to doubt, when he started to wonder if he had made a mistake. We saw what the prequels never bothered to show us. We saw the real Dooku. Dooku was not just a warrior or a politician. He was also a teacher. He shaped Asajj Ventress, trained Savage Opress, and left an undeniable mark on the dark side of the Force. His influence did not just disappear. It spread through those he had taught. Even after his death, his lessons remained. And unlike the prequels, where his role as a mentor was barely explored, the Clone Wars made sure we understood what he was passing down. He was not just throwing apprentices away. He was crafting warriors who could carry out his vision. He was building something greater than himself. He was leaving a legacy. But that legacy was also his downfall. Ventress turned against him, Savage failed him, and in the end, he stood alone. He had spent years forging his own path, only to find himself abandoned. He had taught his apprentices how to fight, but he had not taught them how to be loyal. And that mistake cost him everything. That is what made him such a tragic character. He had all the power in the galaxy, all the knowledge, all the skill, but in the end, he had no one left to fight for him. He had believed in himself too much, trusted his own strength too much, and in the moment of his greatest defeat, there was no one left to save him. Dooku was not just another Sith. He was not just another villain. He was a man who had once been great, who had once fought for something noble, who had once believed in the Jedi way. And that is why his story was so powerful in the Clone Wars. It gave him the depth he deserved. The prequels reduced him to a tool, a means to an end, a name to be discarded once he had served his purpose. The Clone Wars made him real. It made him more than just a stepping stone for Anakin. It made him a force of his own, someone who shaped the war as much as anyone else. It made him unforgettable. And that is why the Clone Wars Dooku will always be better than the prequels Dooku. He was not just a Sith, not just a villain, not just another casualty of Palpatine's grand plan. He was a warrior, a leader, a fallen Jedi, a man who once believed in something greater. And because of that, his story will always be one of the greatest tragedies in Star Wars. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this breakdown, be sure to subscribe to Critical Analysis Hub for deep dives into the Star Wars movies, and check out Critical Analysis Hub Plus for case studies on Star Wars shows. Also, if you want to rep the fandom in style, check out the bio for awesome Star Wars Legos and Funko Pops. May the Force be with you. I'll see you in the next one.